We're very thankful for the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy for hosting us today. And we're going to have a conversation today about the Foreign Agents Registration Act. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce the Congressman who's done some wonderful work on this issue and some wonderful work on the War Powers Act. Congressman, thank you.
It was an interesting day on the floor of the House because we were debating a resolution offered by Republicans and Democrats to condemn the president for withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria. And such is sort of the broken way Congress works, you would think that there would be equal time divided among those who were for that resolution and against that resolution. The way Congress works, the Republicans control one side and the Democrats control the other. And so even to have the opportunity to make the case was very limited because you had Democrats ceding all their time to fellow Democrats who wanted to condemn the president for that action, and then you had Republicans yielding their time to fellow Republicans who wanted to condemn the president for this particular action. So we didn't have as robust an opportunity to make what I think is the right argument, that if we are going to send our bravest Americans downrange to fight, we ought to have the courage in the United States Congress to vote for or against that fight. And I think one of the reasons why you didn't have that courage on display in the Congress now is that this Syria conflict is so messy, we don't even know who the hell we would declare war on. You know, would we declare war on the Free Syrian Army? It was just months ago that our CIA was funding them. And so would we declare war on Turkey, a NATO ally? Would we declare war on Assad? It remains to be seen how that would play out, and I think it highlights the complexity of these issues, and it also highlights the extent to which U.S. involvement is not helpful in every occurrence and in every circumstance as a de-escalating event. I took particular note of the debate today from many of my colleagues who have worn the uniform. And I have tremendous respect for their viewpoint because it is informed by an elite level of patriotism that I was not capable of displaying. I didn't wear the uniform. I didn't go downrange. But I got a lot of colleagues who did. And when they speak on these matters of war and peace, it should weigh on all of us. So I will share with you why I hold a different view and what that's informed by. I represent the district in the United States Congress that has more active duty military than any other. These are the people I love deeply, who have shaped my entire life experience, and who I think we ought to be worthy of in the work that we do. But growing up in a military community, being the congressman for the district that has the most deployed wing in the entire United States Air Force, being the congressman for the 7th Special Forces Group that goes deep into the fight and frequently suffers some of the heaviest casualties in the Army, being the congressman for every major pilot that comes through the Navy, either at NAS Pensacola or Whiting Field, I not only see the consequence of their service, I see the impact of these forever wars on the rest of my community. I see the tearful hugs and goodbyes at airports. I see the interrupted parenting. I see the destroyed marriages, the drug abuse, veteran suicide, seeing coffins come back draped in flags, and then going through the process of appropriately remembering the fallen as we name roads, bridges, and halls of learning after those who've laid their life down. The consequences of these wars last far beyond the last shot being fired in anger, because the children who grow up that deal with the impacts of these deployments, the consequence to their lives and their community, is something that shapes the fabric of our nation. And that's why I try to advocate for a restrained foreign policy, for not leaping into 3 wars before lunchtime tomorrow with any basis whatsoever. And it's why I stand with this president in his fight against endless wars. Donald Trump is the first president since Ronald Reagan to end a Middle East war. And I hope he's able to end more of them because I think that it will reflect better on our nation. It will reduce the instances of threat construction to feed a military-industrial complex in this town. I also heard a number of colleagues today on the floor comment about the aggression from Turkey and that being a basis for us to stay in Syria. That's crazy to me. If people don't believe that Turkey is acting like a NATO ally, they ought to come together and make the case for Turkey to be removed from NATO. But the notion that Turkey's not acting like a NATO ally justifies our continued presence in Syria seems to lack common sense to me. Folks debated, well, we shouldn't pull out of Syria without a strategy. I would argue that we shouldn't stay in Syria without a strategy. And that seemed to be the current mission state. No real objective that was obtainable in any period of time. And there are some who I think would like to see our country engaged militarily in every conflict, in every corner of the globe. But I think that U.S. foreign policy during my lifetime has indicated that that is not a winning strategy, that that's not something that is ultimately sustainable for a voluntary fighting force and for a country that has achieved greatness, but that I believe will lose it if we follow the path of too many other great civilizations that became overextended and that didn't follow the right authorities. I'm incredibly proud. Thank you, I appreciate that. I'm incredibly proud that our movement, while it is not the dominant movement in this town, the dominant movement in this town, I think, is to sell out to the war lobby. That's where we see far too many Republicans and Democrats going. But our movement is unique in its breadth and the type of people that we recruit. I saw before the debate the other day, somebody on Twitter tweeted out, well, Tulsi Gabbard, you shouldn't even go to the debate. You should just go hang out with your buddy Matt Gaetz. And I thought, what a critique to say that because Congresswoman Gabbard and I agree that we should not be engaged in a strategy of endless regime change wars in the absence of congressional approval, that somehow that is a bad thing for both of us. I think that to be able to build a coalition of people like Ken Buck, myself, Andy Biggs, who would likely and appropriately be deemed on the right side of the political spectrum, that we would work right alongside people like Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna, that we would work with the President of the United States, and that we would try to show that this is not an issue that should divide Republicans and Democrats. It truly divides those who have the courage to stand up to the special interests in this town, who always clamor for war, and those who I think appropriately view the role of Congress as one that should speak to these important matters of war and peace. So again, today was not a great day for us in that there was a bipartisan condemnation of what I think was an appropriate move by the President of the United States, but we continue to demonstrate that if we get smart folks who are willing to be reflective on our constitutional obligations and who will learn the lessons of the failures of the foreign policy of the last several decades, that we have the more sustainable movement, because ours is based on intellectual honesty, pragmatism, and realism. And that's why discussions like those you host are so important, because you are the intellectual fiber of the work that we're doing. So thank you all very much, and please help me encourage others to join us in our cause. I appreciate it. If anyone, I would yield the floor to my far more impressive and intelligent colleague, but if anyone had any questions for me or any advice, I'd be willing to take it. No? All right. Well, fix FARA for us.
What about the chances of Congress actually doing something about Syria? There's talk that Lindsey Graham is going to be putting something on the floor to demand the president leave troops in.
Well, today we saw the beginning of that process. We saw a bipartisan condemnation of the United States House of Representatives for what I think were the right actions of our president to do precisely what he promised in his campaign and precisely what he said he's going to do throughout this presidency. And I think that there is this flawed argument that my friend Senator Graham is making about the nature of U.S. alliances. I think Senator Graham would have us believe that if we join with one ally for a unified mission around one issue set, that we are somehow wedded to that ally in every conflict that they may have, past, present, or future. I don't believe that that paradigm strengthens the utility of our future alliances. I think it diminishes them. Because if we have to say to any future ally, we're in for any conflict you have, past, present, or future, then that will reduce the likelihood of strategic engagement around a strategic imperative or interest or objective. And so I disagree with what Senator Graham is attempting, but I'm also in awe of his legislative skills and abilities, and I know that he is out talking to a lot of folks about trying to push back against what the president's done. Hopefully, our vice president, I think in the air or about to land in Turkey at some point, that his delegation will be successful, because I'm no apologist for the Turks. I think that what they're doing right now is improper and that there must be consequence, but we cannot hold the view that in every conflict with every ally that we are forever married to every fight they may have.
Yeah, well, the president today roundly criticized Lindsey Graham, saying that he wanted to be there for 1,000 years, so he's tripling down on this, and it's good to see that he's standing up.
I love the president and I love Lindsey Graham, but I have been with them when they sort of fight like the two old guys that watch the Muppet shows, where they're like up there just kind of kibitzing with each other. And that is something that hopefully will allow the more realistic and reasonable arguments to rise to the surface. One thing I can say about this president, he calls the shots. He has surrounded himself with people from the neocon movement, and a lot of folks would say, well, why would you do that as a president? Wouldn't you want your whole administration to speak with one voice? And I think this president is unique in that he wants different viewpoints. He wants to observe the debate among smart people around these issues, and he wants to be somewhat unpredictable to the rest of the world. But having been someone who speaks frequently with the president on foreign policy issues, having spent quite a bit of time talking to him about Syria and Turkey and the Kurds, he knows what's right, and he's not someone who's going to be moved off of a realistic view of foreign policy just because pressures inside the beltway of Washington are mounting. Anything else? Great. Enjoy Ken Buck. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, George, and folks, for being here. I want to disagree with my friend Matt Gates on one thing. He said that Andy and Matt and I are on the right. We are on the far right. Make no mistake about that. And I have to tell you, the situation that we have going on right now in Syria, Turkey, with the Kurds, is a situation that Congress caused more than the president. If we had debated the issue when we should have debated the issue, when President Obama went into Syria, we would have had some idea of an exit strategy, some idea, first of all, whether it would be authorized or not, some idea of what the goals were being in Syria, and we would have a rational response to the president of Turkey's phone call with the president of the United States. So I put the burden on Congress for not having done the right thing years ago in this area. And I think that if we are going to address foreign policy now, we should be looking at Yemen, we should be looking at many other parts of the world and having the debate. Don't point the finger at the president and say the president did the wrong thing unless you're going to have a debate about our involvement around the world. We shy away from those debates, and it's a mistake to shy away from those debates. So I think, honestly, we have avoided our Article I responsibilities, and until the time that we step forward and take on those responsibilities, we should not be engaged in a sort of this dialogue and really, I don't know if today's vote was bipartisan, but there are certainly more serious votes down the road. But the first thing we should do is hold hearings. So I am happy to be here and happy to answer any questions that anybody might have. And there's great food over there. I don't know if I mentioned the food part.
Well, I'll ask another question. What do you think the chances are that Congress gets a vote out on whether the troops must stay in Syria? Do you think there's enough of a bipartisan movement for this, or is this going to just be something that hits one house and dies in the other?
Oh, it's anytime you see ugly pictures on TV, Congress is going to make a statement, but Congress is not going to make a statement where you'll see ugly pictures of American forces getting killed in action. So no, I think this is a one-time shot, and I think that Congress will be silent after this. If we were serious, if Congress was serious, if the chairman who offered the bill, the resolution today was serious, he would immediately hold hearings on other hot spots around the world what the United States was involved in and address the issue. He didn't.
Well,
So,
what can we do? What can citizens, what can concerned people do to press Congress to do something?
yeah, I think I'm drafting an op-ed as we speak on a few different issues. There's more than one issue going on right now. So I've got an impeachment op-ed and I've got a Syria op-ed going right now. But I think the most important thing that people can do is to make sure that the information is out there in the public so that members are held accountable and we start getting more involved in foreign policy. We have ceded foreign policy because there is far greater downside to getting involved than there is upside. And as a result, Congress or most members of Congress individually have made a decision to stay away. I think it's a mistake. Well, thanks, folks, for being here, and thanks for caring.
Lee, please.
Thanks very much, Ben. I have myself been practicing FARA law for more years than I like to remember, certainly back into the 90s. And I want to talk a little bit about the statute, what it is meant to achieve, what it has been achieving, where the problems have been, and a number of the proposals for reform. Certainly, as a practical matter, obviously, I don't know how many in this room heard of FARA before the whole Russian business before 2016. Certainly, it has always, in my experience, up until the last 3 years, been a relatively quiet area of practice. You have many people, particularly in this city, who ought to be registered. A lot of them seek legal advice, and some register, and some ultimately don't have to. Many do not even know that they are required to register, or at least they didn't up until the most recent events. The statute itself, as some of you may know, goes back to the 1930s. It was prompted by an effort by the German government, the Nazi government then, to affect U.S. Opinion and to lobby Congress. They had come to the conclusion, probably correctly, that the British had outdone them when it came to propaganda, quote unquote, in the First World War, and they were determined that that wouldn't happen again, probably misreading things a bit. But nonetheless, they were very active here. And with an organization called the German American Bund, as well as just plain old German agents, both funding, lobbying, and directing it. And so Congress adopted a law that required disclosure. There would be significant First Amendment and petition clause problems with actually forbidding people to lobby Congress on behalf of foreign governments or foreign companies. And so they took the disclosure route, which actually, if FARA had been seriously enforced, would probably have achieved quite a bit. The law originally required a series of disclosures. Those disclosures have been increased over the years as things have developed. Obviously, as time went on, the concern was no longer German activity, but Soviet activity. In the 60s, it actually became, in part, Congress made some amendments to the law because of the activity of big sugar interests from the Caribbean and South America. At this point, the law requires anyone who represents a foreign principal in certain activities to register, and foreign principal is actually quite broad. It's anybody who is outside the United States, including U.S. nationals. If you are an expat and you are not domiciled in the United States, you can actually be a foreign principal. But most importantly, it covers foreign governments, foreign political parties, and foreign corporations, as well as foreign think tanks, anyone who is organized outside the United States or domiciled outside the United States. If they come here, FARA is actually a territorial statute. It applies to activity here in the United States, as well as certain, U.S. military bases overseas and such, rather than the whole world. You will have to register and do the reporting. Now, the activities that are of concern under the statute, as you can imagine, are principally lobbying Congress, as well as public relations activities. That, going back to the original problem in the 30s, one of the areas that the German government was very active in was not just lobbying Congress, it was public relations. And so that was a key part of the statute and still is. In addition, if you are engaged in informational activities, and this can be propaganda activities, or it can be things like promoting travel and vacations. One of the 20 years ago, when you looked at the FARA list of registrants, what you would notice certainly is that many of them were foreign government tourist authorities, because they were distributing information on behalf of their governments in the United States, and they were required to register, and mostly they did. Even though the truth is we kind of all know who does the ads and who is behind the ads and what they want us to do, they're actually pretty compliant sort of community. But in addition, the law requires you to register if you not just engage in political activities, very broadly defined, but if you are a political consultant. One of the reasons a lot of people, who were not registered and should have been, fell into that basket is because they just didn't know, never would have thought they had to. But if you are privately advising a foreign government on U.S. politics and its relationship to the United States government, you're required to register. The same is true if you are advising them on public relations matters. So that the law is really very broad. Now, of course, one of the problems has been that it has never really been a priority for enforcement. The law is enforced by the Department of Justice, and it has never really fallen into one of the areas where DOJ kind of is comfortable, where its main enforcement objectives, even though it is in fact a criminal statute. One of the problems, indeed, is that under FARA, the penalties for violation of the statute are criminal, felony, and the only potential enforcement on the civil side would be to go to court to get a judicial order requiring someone to register, and then if they refuse to register, to get the court to sanction them for contempt. It has always been a very awkward and difficult to use system because, of course, on the criminal side, it is what we call a specific intent crime. If you are going to violate it and be prosecuted, your violation has to be willful, very high standard of proof, and of course, the beyond a reasonable doubt of a criminal trial. The reason a lot of criminal trials haven't been brought, frankly, is because the standards for achieving a conviction were and are so high. One of the very important proposals that you see in a number of the current proposed bills is the addition of civil enforcement authority. I think that's critical. Civil penalties, so that you don't have to choose between asking a judge for help and a criminal prosecution. You have something in the middle that will assist in or will give them an option that they will really use. But in addition, on that side of things, there is also a number of proposals to give the Justice Department civil demand authority, which would effectively be the equivalent of a subpoena, but to use a subpoena, you actually have to have proceedings going, be it a civil enforcement action or criminal enforcement action. So this would give them a investigative tool that would allow more serious investigations of those who are not registered and should be. That is very broad authority, very powerful authority, and there are also a number of proposals that it should be limited to just the Attorney General or his designee, which is actually quite a good idea, so that it isn't abused. But it is a critical reform of those out there. In terms of other sections of FARA, there are a number of exceptions. So if you are a foreign agent, there are a number of exemptions that you may fall under that mean you don't have to register. Probably the most important of those is the commercial exemption, which is if all you're doing is commercial activity. That is all you're doing. You can't be doing any political activity on the side. You're exempt. So if you're just a foreign corporation who is engaged in commercial activities, you don't have to register. Another important exemption is the legal exemption. If you are a lawyer, a law firm representing foreign clients, foreign government clients, as well as non-government clients in U.S. courts or other types of administrative proceedings, you also are not required to register unless you engage in lobbying in addition to that. Again, the thought being, well, you are out in the open representing these entities in court, so there's not much doubt about what you're doing and who you're working for. And then there are a series of exemptions for diplomats, certain newspapers, for educational associations. You sort of go down the list, most of which don't really matter that much because they don't really cover all that many people. But the one that has really come under a great deal of criticism is the Lobbying Disclosure Act exemption. When the Lobbying Disclosure Act was adopted in 1995, Congress actually created a new FARA exemption so that if you register under the LDA and report under that statute, which is much less detailed than FARA, then you are also exempt from FARA. Many of the proposals that are now before Congress would eliminate that. Indeed, for example, the proposal by Senator Grassley is principally the elimination of that exemption. And there is a lot of force behind that because certainly there has been a fair amount of abuse, people who really don't qualify for the exemption, but who nonetheless use it to avoid FARA registration. And so the elimination of that is one of the proposals on the table. In terms of why the statute, well, first of all, why people don't want to register. I mean, obviously, registration is an onerous process, and the reporting is very detailed. And as Ben is going to get to in a minute, the forms can be done in great detail, or they can be done in fairly sloppy form. But it is a fairly onerous process, and so many people are resistant to registering because of that. Others are, maybe they are engaged in nefarious activity. But frankly, in my experience, one of the biggest reasons why people do not register or do not care to register in this city is the scarlet letter problem, which is to say, if you have any aspiration towards either appointive or elective office, you do not want to be the registered agent of a foreign principal. Now, there's nothing illegal about that. In fact, you're actually complying with the law. But as you can imagine, it's more a political thing. And so you get, and indeed we saw that in the case of Greg Craig, who had been the White House counsel under the Obama administration, and who was recently prosecuted for failing to comply with FARA. And I don't think there's any doubt that his resistance where he really got into trouble ultimately was lying to the Justice Department. But his resistance was because he didn't want to be branded as a foreign agent in case he had future aspirations. I'm not sure there's anything you can really do about that, but more aggressive enforcement would certainly, I think, lead people to register even if they have to or not engage in the activities. In terms of other, potential types of reforms that make sense in addition to the civil fines, one of the important, as Ben will get into, one of the important reforms is to actually get the data, because the FARA unit does collect a lot of data. To make it usable, to actually create a database that is searchable and manipulable so that you can actually analyze the data in a lot of different ways. That is not the case now. And that would actually really help to achieve the ultimate goal of FARA, which is not to stop people from representing foreign governments or foreign corporations or even individuals, but to make it public, and so that sunshine being the best disinfectant. And I think that is in some but not all of the reform proposals. And again, who knows what bill is actually going to prevail in the end, or whether there will be any bill, given the situation in Congress today. But in any case, that's a general description of FARA and the proposed reforms. Let me turn it over to Ben so we can actually see some of what the Justice Department gets and what, if you are interested in trying to figure out foreign influence, you are faced with.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. To pick up on a few things that Lee said there, I think we're at a very fascinating moment, sort of in the life of FARA. In many ways, for decades, FARA was this sort of sleeping giant. In a way, it was this foreign influence bill that was there, had these serious criminal penalties, had all this transparency to it. But it was sleeping because it wasn't really enforced. Nobody was really taking a hard look at FARA filings, and in many ways around D.C., it was sort of willfully ignored in many cases. And a lot of folks who should have been registered, they weren't registered, and folks that were registered, they weren't completing the filings accurately. And so by and large, it was sort of this toothless statute. I think that's all changed recently. And I think that's changed in some cases for the better. I think it's a lot tougher now to say that you don't know about the Foreign Agents Registration Act. My mom literally sells seashells by the seashore in Florida. She knows what the Foreign Agents Registration Act is. So I think all of us here in D.C., we have no excuse to not know what the Foreign Agents Registration Act is. And because of that, we're seeing a lot more registrations under FARA. We're seeing a lot more folks who at the very least are registering, and they are at a basic level complying with the law. And what we do at the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative, we take a look at those filings, and we try to connect some of the dots. We try to identify, I would say, some of the swamp creatures per our previous documentary here, and we try to point out some of the malfeasance there. And what I think we're seeing, what we've noticed is sort of a pattern of, despite there being more folks who are filing, I think the level of transparency in those filings is actually going down. You're seeing of those firms who do file, whether it's for ignorance about what they have to file, or whether they're willfully simply not reporting the information that they should be, we're getting less and less out of more and more FARA filings. And in the report, which we have our new report, which is a very timely event, we just released yesterday on the United Arab Emirates lobby. It's in some of the packets and it's out on the table, and we have some more copies here if you'd like one. What we really found in there was exactly this going on with the Emirati lobby. In 2018, there were 20 firms working for the Emirates in DC. Just 4 reported the political activity that they were doing. Just 4. I mean, we're not even talking a quarter of the firms. We're able to document the political activity for those firms and able to tell folks who those firms are, who they're talking with, who they're meeting with in Congress, who, which reporters at the Washington Post they're talking with. But for those other 16 firms, we have no idea. It's this phenomenal black box. And the kicker of it is, as we point out in the report, some of those 16 firms, they're actually working for the 4 big firms. Firms like Aiken Gump and the Harbor Group, they subcontract out a lot of their lobbying, their FARA work to these other firms, and then these other firms simply don't report what they're doing. In other cases, as Lee mentioned, there's really no standardized system to FARA. In terms of the filings, there's templates for the forms where you can see, okay, I got to fill out these questions. None of it's digitized. And it's in many ways, it's still, it always seems to me, I joke, it's still stuck back in 1938. Because we see many of these FARA filings, and I sent my interns here on the painstaking task of tracking down as many of these filings as they could. And we found scores of just handwritten filings where you would just write in there, well, who'd you talk to? Congressman so and so, and literally just handwritten every sort of little meeting they had, which is all well and good, except lobbyists, I guess maybe some of them are doctors, they don't write too well. And so in many cases, we flat out can't read this handwriting. It just looks like a bunch of scribbles on a form. And yet this is the level of transparency that we're being afforded by FARA. And in other cases, when it is typed out, sometimes the font is so small that we're literally in there, we're zooming in to 200 and 250% in these PDFs to try and get a look at it. We still can't make it out. Sometimes they're scanned, and it looks like, you ever play the old copier game where you copy the same thing, 4 times over? It looks like that's what some of these FARA filings look like, and you just flat out can't see any of the information that's in there. So we call it transparency that's hiding in plain sight in some cases. While the information, it's technically there, these are folks that are registered under FARA, we're not really getting any level of transparency about what they're doing. And so one of the big pushes and one of the initiatives that we're really trying to get folks to focus on is what happens next after FARA registration. And I'm very sympathetic to Lee's point about the foreign agent being something of a scarlet letter. My pushback to that always, though, Lee, is that I always remind folks that of my favorite foreign agent, the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama has been registered, the Office of Tibet specifically, has been registered under FARA for years because they come to the U.S. and solicit money and contributions, which is one of the other sort of niche areas of FARA. And so unless you think the Dalai Lama, deserves a scarlet letter, it's not all, foreign agents aren't all that bad. But even though I'm sympathetic to that, and we have seen a lot more enforcement actions for people who don't register under FARA, I can count the number of enforcement actions against folks who underreport their FARA actions on 0 fingers, because it hasn't happened. There has yet to be any serious or any meaningful enforcement action against somebody who underreported a FARA filing. And we've seen FARA filings that were absolutely and completely incomplete. A Saudi lobbying firm just 2 years ago filed a FARA form. FARA forms have check boxes too, and you can fill them out by hand. Didn't have any of the boxes filled out even. Just incredibly basic stuff. And again, some of these are handwritten. Some of these just don't report the political activities or anything that they're supposed to report. None of these things are enforced. There's really no punishment for this sort of work. And so this is, I think, where Lee's point about the civil fines really comes into bearing. That if you don't have any sort of punishment for that, then firms are just going to keep going on doing this. And I'm also sympathetic to the other argument that I often get back where folks say, well, Ben, are you going to throw us in jail for just not filing some forms right? And my curt answer on my bad days is yes, I would love to do that. But I think on a basic level, we need some sort of middle ground, like Lee said. You know, we need some way to incentivize folks to do these filings correctly. And I think civil fines are a great way to get at that. So instead of saying we're going to throw you in jail for not filing paperwork right, we're going to create, we're going to give you a speeding ticket for not doing that right, let you know what you did wrong. Hopefully you can correct it in the future and incentivize those folks who have already registered to do it the right way. Another important thing that we're working on right now is a number of bills, and I know some folks, including Representative Buck and some other folks on the Hill, are considering this, is a way to create a system for FARA that digitizes these filings. It's not 1938 anymore. It's the 21st century. We can digitize all this stuff. The Lobbying Disclosure Act, which Lee mentioned, it's completely digitized for those of you who are lobbyists or have been lobbyists in the past. You know, it's a pretty easy system to fill out your forms. If you're registering under the LDA, it's all done electronically. It's filed electronically. There's an electronic database. A nerd like me who's on the outside who wants to see what you're up to, I can quickly search that database, search for all your filings, see what's going on. It's very, very easy to use. And I think it's high time that FARA had a system like that, where you can just go in and, you know, it's sort of point and click, you know, political activities, who'd you meet with, and you can type it all in right there very easily. I think it'll be easier for the firms. It'll certainly be easier for transparency and oversight. And if we're looking for real accountability for these firms and for a lot of this foreign government lobbying in D.C., I think it's high time that we had something like this happen. With that, I will get off my high horse. And unless you have anything, I'd like to.
The only thing I would add is one thing I did forget to mention. One of the reasons that the filings are not reviewed or have not been reviewed, although we're exponentially better than 20 years ago when you actually had to go down to the New York Avenue Annex and bring quarters if you wanted to access any of this, is that the FARA unit, which has kind of been yelled at by Congress, but it's like in 2016, it was 8 people. 3 lawyers and 5 staff assistants. Even with the number of registrations that they were getting then, which has a lot less than I'm sure they're getting now, it would be an impossible task, both to try to police the statute, find people who should be registered and aren't, and to make sure, you know, go through the filings. If Congress is serious, and I hope they are, they're going to have to actually give some dollars to the Justice Department to take that tiny unit and make it into more of an enforcement section. I mean, you know, there are many of those at the department that are well funded. So that's
good news on that front. I just talked to somebody over here, and the staff has grown.
Excellent.
They now have 9 people.
9 people. Well, it's a start.
That's not it. I wish that was a joke, but there are, as of last counting, there are 9 people at the FARA unit now. There's a separate outside group of folks at the FBI who do investigate foreign influence, but and a lot has been made of them. But those are not. It's important to realize those are not dedicated FARA staff. They have a wider portfolio than that, and so the number of people we were talking about, and Lee's exactly right, the number of filings, especially post-2016, has increased remarkably. I think at last count there are over 2,000 individual, they call them short form registrants, so that's like individual people who are registered under FARA. So if you do the math there, and there's only 9 folks in the FARA registration unit, they're completely outmatched. With that, happy to take any questions you guys might have. Yes.
So like you said, there's a lot of different proposals in the House and Senate right now. Is there anything that you think would be particularly useful that you haven't seen in the bill yet?
I mean, I'm biased to the one.
Yeah.
Right. I'm biased to the one we've been working on. So we've sort of to tip our hand a little bit. We've been working on one that is that would effectively do what I discussed about sort of digitizing all of this and creating an LDA-like system and database to really automate all this. It would take a lot of burden off the registration unit too. So instead of them having to, upload all these PDF, scan everything, upload it into the system as a PDF. It would take all that out of it. It would automate this process. And I'll just say one other anecdote about this real quick. In our UAE report, one of the problems in this current system they have is that so they get these filings in, and then they still separately, you can electronically submit it now. You don't have to go there anymore, blissfully. You can electronically submit your forms to DOJ, but DOJ, they don't automatically get posted to the website when you do that. And that can be extremely problematic, as we found out in the midst of this UAE report. We discovered one of the firm's filings that was over a year old just wasn't online anywhere, and I'm like thinking, did I miss something? Am I crazy? What's going on here? So I finally emailed them, and then the FARA unit, bless their hearts. So now you know I'm going to say something bad about them. Bless their hearts. They said, "Oh, we just hadn't posted that. Here it is," and they just emailed it to me, and it's an 80-page long, report with literally hundreds of new political activities that we wanted to add to the report, and it was over a year old, not in the system. So really, and that's a side shoot to your question, but we really think that having an automated system, a digitized system, would really cure that problem and a lot of others.
Yeah, and that one or two of the proposals do address that, but it is not. It is no one's central sort of focus. And in many ways, if you want the statute to do what it was supposed to do, it needs to be.
Have you considered attaching fines to it, and how much the fine would be for first-time offenders, second?
Well, that would be the civil fine provision. You can either establish a range. Usually, there's a range up to $5,000 or $10,000 or whatever that will hopefully deter people. I mean, one of the things about FAIR, of course, is if you don't register, it becomes a continuing violation for every day that you're not registered. And if you were to do the civil fines the way it's done, for example, under the Clean Water Act, you could end up with, even if it's just $1,000 or $5,000, you could end up with a lot of money being owed very quickly. If it is a daily, but I mean those are I think are under consideration in some of the bills. But again, I don't think that is a focus. I think the civil investigative authority is a focus of a lot of the bills, so there's a good start. But the civil penalties, I think, are not. I'm not entirely sure why that is.
Could you use to fund hiring maybe more people to work at FARA?
Yeah, I mean that's although those kinds of bounty systems have their own problems. But certainly upping the fees, they're relatively modest at this point, given who's paying them. I mean, it's $305 to file, and that is, Aiken Gump and
Right.
Arnold Porter and my firm, and probably can afford more, especially since it mostly gets passed on to the client.
That's
And so that would be one means of raising some additional revenue. But really, if Congress is serious, they need to seriously expand that office, both with investigators, dedicated investigators, be it on detail from the Bureau or just working for them, as well as people to go through these filings and make sure that they've been done correctly. And then, of course, the lawyers who decide who should be registered and how to enforce against them. So every aspect of this needs attention.
Because the issue right now, frankly, is that, and I've tried to explain this to folks is that there's really a perverse incentive system for folks who are registered and who are filing correctly, as Lee said. So if you're and I mentioned Aiken Gump before, and I'll tell you, folks who know me, I wouldn't normally pat Aiken Gump on the back, but when it comes to FARA filings, they really do follow the letter of the law. They file everything on time. They report everything that they're doing, who they're doing it for, how much they're getting paid for it. I think everything they do is really completely above the board. But then you see they see other firms who aren't doing that and who are not being penalized for that behavior. And I actually heard a FARA compliance person, not at Aiken Gump, but another large firm, who said she actually emailed DOJ with a question about, she was the one responsible for filing their FARA material, and she had noticed another firm was doing something that we'll say was a little less transparent than she was doing. And so she, emailed DOJ about it and said, well, I see this other firm is doing this thing that's less transparent. Is that okay that they're doing that? Because if so, we'd like to do that. DOJ basically responds back with, yes, we have not penalized them for doing that, but no, you can't do that. So don't have your cake and don't eat it too. Yeah. But she was explicitly going to that lower level of compliance, and until we get to a point where we're actually going to incentivize through carrots or sticks folks to fully comply with this, you're going to have this race to the bottom of transparency, which frankly we're already seeing.
And from a self-interest standpoint, what's the best incentive for this Congress and the majority to bring your favorite bill to a vote from the self-interest, from their perspective, given how much this town seems to be run by the sloppiness of this, having all this influence go undetected?
I would say it makes and gosh, I hate to say this, but it does make a great campaign talking point. If you are the champion of a piece of legislation that is designed to counter foreign influence, and today, and I think it's hard for me to find when certainly there's a foreign influence industrial complex here, as I affectionately call it. But once I talk to folks out in real America, I yet to find anybody, Republican or Democrat, out there that's really pro foreign influence. Somebody that says I wish the Chinese or the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Russians, for that matter, were exercising more influence. And so I think on the campaign trail for folks, if you're out there and you're on one of these bills, you're introducing it and you're really pushing it, you're fighting for it, I think there's some good electoral benefits to doing that.
Yeah, and one thing I would add, the interesting thing is FARA is but a sliver of the potential or the actual foreign influence in this country, because of course every university gets money from foreign governments one way or another, at least the big ones. The think tanks here in town, the big ones tend to get lots of money from foreign governments. They can avoid registration by essentially telling that government, well, you don't have anything to say about how it is spent. But of course, they certainly want to please their donors. Everyone wants to please their donors, and so, but there's a lot out there that even the proposal we were working on does have some additional reporting requirements for such institutions that would not require FARA registration, but would at least require, amount, purpose, government. Just give us that much.
Yeah. That's the state of affairs we're at right now. Since you brought up think tanks, I'll shamelessly plug a report we have coming out next month on foreign funding of think tanks. And the problem that we have now with this issue is that you have no idea which foreign government is funding which think tank, because the think tanks don't have to disclose their funding. Many of the larger think tanks do, but plenty of them absolutely do not. And I think it's a major issue, because the anecdotal stories that we do hear coming out of think tanks are that these foreign donors to think tanks really, really matter in some cases, and they do affect the work. They do affect what these quote unquote experts are saying. One example that I bring up, and we cover this in the UAE report, UAE funds a lot of think tanks around town. According to our analysis, they're one of the top 5 funders of think tanks in DC. And what their lobbyists do, they disproportionately meet with experts at those think tanks, which the UAE is also funding. And we identify a few cases where they do what I call talking point laundering, where the foreign agent will go to, have talking points in hand, as any good lobbyist will do, meet with a think tank expert, and then a couple days later we'll see a nice op-ed from that think tank expert that, surprisingly, has exactly those same talking points in it. And then the UAE will have another PR firm that's also registered under FARA to work for them that will then distribute that op-ed to folks on the Hill and make it look as if they're just disseminating this organically created op-ed. Rather than revealing that these are actually talking points coming from UAE registered foreign agents. And folks have no idea that think tank expert doesn't have to disclose that funding publicly. And so, it creates this sort of false impression of that this is this objective person. And that's just one example in writing, too. I hear some of these folks, particularly post-Khashoggi, I heard a lot of folks from the Middle East Institute, for example, and I guess hate to name names, but the Middle East Institute is heavily funded by the UAE and the government of Saudi Arabia. And with a name like the Middle East Institute, they do have a lot of great experts there. They were kind of the go-to after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And not surprisingly, a lot of their commentary was that the U.S. shouldn't change anything. We should stay, just as in bed with the Saudis as we've always been. And so, any objective person would be like, well, maybe we should reconsider this. What about the Yemen war? What about human rights issues? What about 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11? It's like, no, don't worry about that. Very strategic U.S. military ally. We've got to stay there and fight this. Good question, David. Thank you. Anything else, folks?
Thank you.
Thank you, George. Appreciate it. Thank you for myself.